I'm Gloria Mitchell, and if you looked at my family from the outside, you'd think we were blessed beyond measure. People in our community used to call us the Mitchell Empire. My late husband Harold built a chain of car dealerships from the ground up, spreading across North Carolina and into Virginia. He was the type of man who believed in hard work and persistence, and he liked to remind anyone who would listen that he never took a dime of help from anybody. The houses, the vacation properties, the cars in our driveway, and even the reputation of being that family, all came from his drive. But what people didn't see was that beneath all that polish, we were already cracking. I spent most of my marriage standing behind Harold, smiling at the right moments, running our home, and raising our 3 children. That was my assignment as he saw it. The public thought Harold did it all, but truth be told, I kept everything steady when he was too busy playing the role of a powerful man. I held the kids together, I managed the household staff, I made sure bills were paid and appearances were kept. But Harold didn't value that. He saw me as comfortable in the background, and over time my own children started to treat me the same way. Especially Raymond. Raymond, our eldest, was Harold's pride and joy. From a young age, Harold made it clear that Raymond would be his successor. While other kids were outside riding bikes or sneaking into football games, Raymond was learning the ins and outs of dealership contracts and bank loans. On paper, that might sound like good parenting, grooming your son for the business. But what it really did was make him arrogant. By the time he hit 30, Raymond acted like he already owned everything Harold had. He spoke to me like I was a servant, not his mother. And when his father wasn't around, his arrogance turned into entitlement. Raymond believed the world owed him everything simply because he carried the Mitchell name. Denise, my daughter, couldn't have been more different. She was the middle child, the one overlooked not just by Harold, but by Raymond as well. She worked as a nurse, pulling long hours, barely scraping by while raising her own 2 children. Harold had promised to help her with a down payment on a house, but when the time came, he brushed her off, saying she should marry better. Those words crushed her spirit, but she learned to stand on her own, even if it meant living paycheck to paycheck while watching her brother drive new cars every year. Then there was Terrence, my baby. My heart broke for him most of all. He had always been sensitive, the type of boy Harold dismissed as weak. Instead of being groomed, Terrence was scolded, belittled, and overlooked until he found his escape in drugs. By his early 20s, he'd lost nearly a decade to addiction. He burned bridges, pawned valuables, and even stole from me once just to fund his habit. But by the time Harold died, Terrence had been in recovery for 2 years. He was working part-time at a garage, trying to earn his dignity back piece by piece. He was still fragile, but he was trying, and that meant more to me than anything Raymond could flash. So yes, on the surface, we were the Mitchells, the picture of black success, a family people whispered about with admiration and envy. But I lived inside those walls. I knew that Harold's favoritism had poisoned our home, that Raymond's arrogance was rotting his character, that Denise carried wounds she never spoke of, and that Terrence's recovery was a daily battle most ignored. I knew that while Harold polished his legacy, he was blind to the cracks forming in his children. And I also knew something Harold refused to accept. Wealth can cover a lot of things, but it can't heal what's broken in a family. It can't make a spoiled man humble, it can't erase years of favoritism, and it certainly can't guarantee loyalty when life takes its cruel turn. Our fortune was real, but the fractures were too. And those cracks would one day split open so wide that none of us would be able to step over them. What I didn't know then was how quickly it would happen, how fast grief, greed, and betrayal could pull everything apart. Harold's death was the spark, but Raymond's pride would be the fire. Harold's death didn't come with much warning, though in hindsight the signs had been there. He'd always been a man who pushed himself beyond reason. Even in his 70s, he was still working like he was 40, attending dealership meetings, making late-night calls, and traveling between states. He liked to boast that he'd never slow down, that retirement was for weak men. But that stubbornness came with a price. One morning, while reviewing paperwork at his desk, Harold collapsed from a massive heart attack. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Just like that, the man who thought himself indestructible was gone. The days that followed were a blur of condolences, phone calls, and preparations for a funeral bigger than anything I'd ever wanted. Harold had left behind a name people respected, and with that came the spectacle of a service that felt more like a corporate event than a goodbye. Cars lined up outside the church, floral arrangements arrived by the truckload, and men who hadn't spoken to Harold in years suddenly showed up, dressed in their finest, to shake hands and be seen. But behind the polished surface, the cracks in our family grew wider. Raymond took charge of the funeral arrangements as if he were already the head of the family. He talked over me in front of people, dismissed Denise's input, and hardly acknowledged Terence at all. Every decision became his alone, from the casket to the order of service. At one point, when I suggested something Harold once told me he wanted, Raymond brushed me aside with a sharp tone. "Mama, let me handle this. Dad wanted it to look professional. We can't make this about emotions." That cut deeper than he realized. Harold was my husband of more than 40 years, yet my voice meant nothing the moment he was gone. Denise tried to speak up once during a planning meeting, reminding Raymond that Harold had always favored simplicity over extravagance. Raymond snapped back, saying, "That was when he was alive. People expect more now. Don't embarrass us." I watched my daughter shrink in her seat, humiliated, her face turning red as if she had committed some terrible offense. I wanted to protect her, but I knew if I opened my mouth, Raymond would turn his words on me again. Terence was quiet, too quiet. He sat in the back, avoiding confrontation, as if afraid that his past mistakes would make his opinion worthless. Raymond didn't even ask him what he thought. He acted like Terence didn't exist. I could see the pain in Terence's eyes, the way he kept clenching his fists under the table, swallowing his pride just to keep peace. The funeral itself was grand, exactly as Raymond wanted. Black cars, long processions, and a polished obituary that spoke of Harold's achievements in glowing terms. I stood at the graveside, numb, holding back tears, while Raymond shook hands and smiled at businessmen as if it were a networking event. People patted him on the back, calling him the new Mr. Mitchell. It was almost as if Harold's death had become Raymond's stepping stone. When we returned to the house afterward, the tension thickened. Instead of us grieving together, Raymond positioned himself at the head of the dining table, barking orders to staff, telling Denise what she should contribute to the reception, and making remarks about how Terence should be useful for once. I sat there quietly, the widow in black, watching my own son act as though he had been crowned. My heart was breaking, not just from losing Harold, but from seeing the family I had held together for decades come apart before my eyes. Everyone left that night feeling unsettled. Denise went home frustrated and unheard. Terence left with his head down, and I went to bed with a cold realization that Harold's death hadn't just ended his life. It had marked the beginning of a battle I wasn't prepared for. Raymond was no longer just arrogant. He was dangerous with power. He had convinced himself that everything Harold owned now belonged to him. And though Harold was buried in the ground, his shadow loomed larger than ever, pushing us toward conflicts none of us could yet imagine. The will reading took place a week after Harold's funeral, in a polished law office downtown. I remember sitting there in my black dress, still carrying the weight of fresh grief, while Raymond leaned back in his chair like he was waiting for someone to hand him a crown. Denise sat beside me, nervously twisting her hands, and Terence lingered on the other side, clearly uncomfortable in the expensive room. The lawyer, Mr. Franklin, adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading the will Harold had left behind. From the very first line, Raymond's chest swelled. Harold's voice, written in ink, spoke of his great pride in his eldest son, Raymond, for his role in carrying forward the Mitchell name and business. As those words left the lawyer's mouth, Raymond smirked, glancing around the table as if to say, "See? This was always meant for me." The lawyer listed out the assets one by one. The dealerships, the estate, the investment accounts, and the liquid sum of $50 million. And each time Harold's words seemed to reference my eldest son, Raymond practically nodded along, already claiming it in his mind. He didn't wait for the full context, didn't pause to hear every clause. To him, the moment Harold's name was attached to his, it was confirmation that he had been chosen above everyone else. Denise leaned forward at one point, asking quietly if provisions had been made for her and Terence. Raymond cut her off before the lawyer could answer. "Daddy made it clear who the heir is," he said, his tone sharp. "You've had his support all your life. This," he gestured broadly as if to capture the entire empire, "isn't about handouts. This is about responsibility." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay silent. In that moment, Raymond wasn't just grieving. He was gloating. He hadn't even let the lawyer finish before he started laying claim to everything Harold had built. The house we had shared for 40 years. He called it his house. The dealerships Harold and I had spent countless nights discussing. He said they were his businesses. Even the fortune that represented a lifetime of sacrifices, long nights and risks. He spoke of it as though it had always been waiting for him alone. Terence finally spoke up, his voice low but steady. "It's not just yours, Ray. We're his kids too." That was all it took. Raymond turned to him with a glare so cold it cut the air. "Kids who couldn't keep themselves together don't get to run empires," he snapped. "Don't think Dad didn't see your failures. If it weren't for me, this whole family would have gone under years ago." The words stung Terence, and I could see him shrink back, retreating into silence. Denise's face flushed with quiet anger, but she didn't dare speak again. And me. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, listening to my son claim ownership not just of Harold's legacy, but of our dignity as well. When the meeting ended, Raymond didn't even wait for the lawyer's closing remarks. He stood up, straightened his suit, and declared, "I'll take it from here." No hesitation, no humility, no pause for grief. He walked out of that office convinced that the world now revolved around him, and in his mind, Harold's passing had handed him not only wealth, but power over every one of us. That night, back at the estate, Raymond wasted no time proving just how far his arrogance would go. He began directing staff as though I were invisible, instructing them to prepare his office and move Harold's things into storage. He ordered renovations without consulting me, claiming the house needed to reflect his vision now. When Denise dropped by, he mocked her old car, suggesting she park it down the street so it wouldn't embarrass the family. And when Terence came to pay respects at Harold's study, Raymond locked the door behind him, saying, "This room isn't for people who don't understand responsibility." The cruelty wasn't subtle anymore. It was bold, sharp, and immediate. Raymond had waited his whole life for this moment, and now that he believed it was his, he wielded it like a weapon. He didn't see family, he saw subordinates. He didn't see his mother, sister, or brother. He saw obstacles in his empire. As I watched all of this unfold, I could feel something heavy rising in my chest. The grief of losing Harold was hard enough, but seeing my own son step into his father's shoes only to stomp on everything we held sacred, it was unbearable. What none of us realized then, sitting in that office, was that this was only the beginning. Raymond thought the will had sealed his power. In truth, it had only set the stage for his downfall. It didn't take Raymond long to show me just how little space I had left in the home Harold and I had built together. Only days after the will reading, he gathered the staff in the living room and stood in front of them like some newly crowned king. He spoke loudly, with a kind of authority he had never earned, announcing that he was now the man of the house, the head of the family, and the sole person in charge of Harold's legacy. He said it as if Harold's 40 years with me had been nothing but a side note. I stood near the staircase, still wearing the black dress I hadn't had the strength to put away since the funeral, and listened as my son stripped me of dignity in front of people who had once respected me. One of the housekeepers glanced at me with sympathy, but Raymond made sure no one dared to side with me. He turned to me then, his voice cold, and said the words that burned into me forever. "You won't die here, you old-for-nothing gold digger. Pack your things. This house isn't yours anymore." It was like a knife to the chest. This was the same home where I raised him, the same walls where I had carried Harold through sickness and health, the same kitchen where I had cooked his meals while Harold spent nights away building his empire. And now my son was looking me in the eye, stripping me of every ounce of respect, as if I were some intruder who had overstayed her welcome. I tried to steady my voice, but it came out thin. "Raymond, this is my home too. I've lived here longer than you've been alive." He cut me off with a mocking laugh. "Correction, Mama. It was Daddy's home. And now it's mine. You just lived here because of him. But that time is over." Denise, who had come by to check on me, rushed to my side. She tried to stand up for me, her voice trembling with anger. "Raymond, you can't talk to her like that. She's your mother. This is her house too." But Raymond wasn't moved. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to make sure his words hit deep. "Don't defend her, Denise. You always wanted her to save you, but look at her. She couldn't even save herself. She's nothing without Dad, and I'm not about to let her sit here and leech off of me." The room fell silent. Even Terence, who had been standing in the corner, froze in disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but then dropped his head, unable to confront his brother. I had a choice in that moment: fight him and give him the satisfaction of watching me beg, or walk away with what little pride I had left. Chose the latter. I went upstairs, packed a suitcase with clothes and essentials, and came back down the stairs to find Raymond already directing staff to clear Harold's things out of his study. He didn't even look at me as I walked past, as though I were already gone from his life. Denise followed me out, helping me carry my bag to her old car. She hugged me tightly before whispering, "Come stay with me, Mama. You don't deserve this." Tears stung my eyes, but I swallowed them. I refused to give Raymond the satisfaction of seeing me cry on his doorstep. That night, I laid down on Denise's couch in her cramped townhouse, surrounded by the sound of her kids sleeping in the next room. The space was small, far from the luxury I had been used to, but it was warm. It was filled with love, something that mansion no longer carried. As I stared at the ceiling, I replayed Raymond's words in my head: "Old-for-nothing gold digger." I had given everything for that family, and in return I was cast aside like trash. Raymond, meanwhile, wasted no time installing himself as the new patriarch. He moved into Harold's master suite, redecorated the living room to fit his modern style, and began throwing dinners where he invited businessmen, introducing himself as the rightful heir of Harold Mitchell's empire. He stood at the head of the table, the same table I had once set with care, and bragged about the millions now under his control. But what Raymond didn't know, what none of us fully understood yet, was that his throne was made of paper. He thought he had conquered us by pushing me out, but all he had done was set the stage for the kind of downfall money couldn't protect him from. My humiliation wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would shake every corner of his life. 3 days after Raymond threw me out of my own home, I was still trying to adjust to Denise's small townhouse. The couch became my bed, and though Denise's children offered me love that Raymond never could, my heart was heavy with shame. I had gone from being the matriarch of a family empire to carrying my suitcase like a stranger. But then, on that third day, a call came that changed everything. It was Mr. Franklin, Harold's lawyer. His tone was calm, professional, but there was something pointed in his words. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need you and your children back in my office. There are details about the will that need to be clarified. It seems some things were overlooked in our first meeting." I almost didn't want to go, but Denise insisted. Terence came too, quiet as always, but Raymond arrived late, strutting in like a man who owned the world. He wore a new suit, clearly bought with money he assumed was his, and sat down across from me with a smirk. "I don't know why we're here again," he said. "The will already made it clear. I'm in charge now." Mr. Franklin leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and looked directly at Raymond. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Raymond, did you even read the will in full? Or did you just hear what you wanted?" The room went silent. Raymond's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "It said everything goes to me." "That's not what it said," Mr. Franklin replied. He pulled out the thick folder, flipped a few pages, and read aloud. "While my eldest son Raymond is acknowledged for his role in continuing the family name, my assets, businesses, liquid accounts, and properties are to be placed in a trust. That trust is to be controlled and managed by my wife, Gloria Mitchell, for the remainder of her lifetime. Raymond is to serve as beneficiary, with distributions at her discretion, pending his ability to demonstrate responsibility." The words hung in the air like a bomb. Raymond's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Denise's lips curled into the faintest smile, and Terence, for the first time in days, lifted his head. Mr. Franklin wasn't done. He flipped to another document and slid it across the desk. "And furthermore, regarding the estate, Harold amended the deed in 1998. Gloria Mitchell's name was added as co-owner. That property can't be claimed, sold, or transferred without her consent. In other words, Raymond, it was never solely yours to begin with." Raymond slammed his fist on the table. "That's a lie. He told me I would inherit everything." Mr. Franklin raised an eyebrow. "Your father may have told you many things, but he put his trust in your mother, not you. The language is clear. You don't control the money, the house, or the business. Your mother does." I sat there quietly, my heart pounding, the sting of humiliation from 3 days ago still raw. But now I felt the ground shift beneath us. Raymond looked at me, his face twisted in disbelief, and for the first time, he saw that his arrogance had no power. "Mother," he said, his voice cracking, "please, you can't do this. You know I need access to those funds. I have plans. The dealerships." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The truth was in the paperwork, written in black and white, stronger than any of Raymond's pride. Within minutes, the man who had mocked me, called me a gold digger, and thrown me out of my own home, was reduced to begging in front of everyone. His shoulders hunched, his voice desperate. "Mama, please. I can't run this without money. Just give me control." But control was no longer his to demand. It was mine. When we left that office, I walked out with my head high. Denise by my side, Terence just a step behind. Raymond trailed us, broken and silent, the weight of his downfall settling onto his shoulders. 3 days earlier, he had cast me out like I was nothing. Now he was on his knees, begging me for what he thought he'd already won. And that was only the beginning of his crumble. Walking out of that lawyer's office, I didn't feel the need to shout, celebrate, or rub it in. My dignity had already spoken for itself. Harold's words, written years before his death, had restored what Raymond tried to strip from me. The weight of humiliation I carried 3 days earlier began to lift, not because Raymond apologized, but because the truth of who I was and what I meant to Harold was now undeniable. Back at Denise's townhouse that evening, she made me tea and wrapped her arms around me. "Mama," she whispered, "Daddy must have known. He must have seen what Raymond was becoming." Her words gave me comfort. For so long I thought Harold had overlooked me, but in those private amendments to his will and deed, he had finally acknowledged what I had always been, the backbone of our family. Raymond, meanwhile, couldn't hide his shame. The very next day, he showed up at Denise's door, his suit wrinkled, his confidence gone. He tried to act composed, but his eyes betrayed him. He wanted to talk, to convince me to hand him access to the trust, but Denise's children saw him first. "Uncle Ray's here," they shouted, running to the door. He smiled weakly, but I noticed the difference. He wasn't greeted as the new Mr. Mitchell. He was just a man desperate for forgiveness. Inside, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, fumbling with his words. "Mama, we got off on the wrong foot. I didn't mean what I said. I was grieving, I was overwhelmed. You know I can handle the businesses better than anyone. If you could just release some funds." His voice trailed, his hands trembling slightly. But this time I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't raise my voice either. I just looked him in the eye and said calmly, "Raymond, your father trusted me to decide what's best. And that's exactly what I'll do." It was a short answer, but it left him speechless. He expected anger or softness, not a mother who had found her footing again. The family, too, began to shift in ways Raymond hadn't anticipated. Denise, who had always kept her head down, suddenly stood taller. She didn't have to shrink in his presence anymore, not when the law had confirmed what she already knew. He wasn't the sole heir, he wasn't untouchable. Terence, though still fragile, began to gain confidence as well. He told me later that seeing Raymond beg in front of the lawyer gave him a strange sense of justice. For once, he couldn't hide behind Dad's shadow, Terence said. Raymond's embarrassment spread quickly through the family. Cousins who had attended the funeral began whispering, asking why he no longer spoke with the same authority. Even Yolanda, his wife, grew quieter around him. She had stood proudly beside him during the funeral, introducing herself as the new Mrs. Mitchell, but now she avoided making eye contact at gatherings, as though she knew his pedestal had crumbled. I didn't gloat. I didn't tell anyone what they should think of him. I didn't have to. The silent shift was happening on its own. Every time Raymond tried to assert control, someone would glance toward me, waiting for my confirmation. At family dinners, the staff he once barked orders at now hesitated, looking in my direction before moving. The power he tried to claim had slipped back into my hands, without me ever raising my voice. For Raymond it was unbearable. The man who thought himself the center of the empire was now sitting at the edge, ignored, dismissed, and stripped of the control he believed was his birthright. He tried to save face, but each attempt only deepened the cracks in his image. The more he insisted he was in charge, the more obvious it became that he wasn't. I didn't need to humiliate him further. I didn't need to scream or fight. My revenge had already begun, not through force but through dignity. I sat calmly, carried myself with quiet strength, and let the truth do the work. Raymond's downfall wasn't loud. It was slow, public, and humiliating in ways only silence could achieve. And as the fractures widened in our family, I could sense something even greater coming. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about legacy, loyalty, and the lies Raymond had been hiding for years. He thought losing control of the trust was the end of his problems. He hadn't yet realized it was only the beginning. When Harold was alive, his younger brother Leon was always kept at arm's length. He had once been part of the dealership board, but Harold caught him skimming money from accounts and using company funds to fuel his gambling addiction. Harold pushed him out quietly to avoid scandal, but he never fully cut ties. That was Harold's flaw. He thought he could control Leon, when in truth Leon was the kind of man who thrived in shadows. After the funeral, Leon disappeared for a while, just long enough to make it seem like he was grieving. But when the whispers about the will started circulating, about how Raymond didn't truly control the empire, Leon saw his opening. And he came back, not with condolences, but with threats. I heard about it first from Terence. He had stopped by the estate to check on Raymond, only to find Leon sitting comfortably in Harold's old study, a glass of scotch in his hand, smirking like he owned the place. Raymond was pacing, sweating. His usual arrogance cracked wide open. "What are you doing here, Leon?" Terence had asked, his voice cautious. Leon had leaned back in Harold's leather chair, tapping his fingers against the glass. "I'm here to remind little Raymond that debts don't disappear just because a man dies. Your daddy kept me off the books, but I've still got the receipts. And if Raymond here doesn't want me dragging those skeletons into the light, he'll find a way to make me comfortable." When Terence told me what he'd seen, I wasn't surprised. Leon had always been circling, waiting for weakness. And Raymond was nothing if not weak in the face of exposure. I later learned that Raymond had borrowed money from Leon years ago to cover gambling nights of his own. He thought Harold would never find out, but Leon kept the IOUs tucked away like weapons. With Harold gone and Raymond stripped of control over the trust, those old secrets became tools of blackmail. Leon began visiting the estate more frequently, strutting through the halls like he had every right to be there. The staff looked uneasy, but Raymond didn't stop him. He couldn't. Leon had him by the throat. Whenever I saw Raymond now, he looked thinner, distracted, as if he were carrying the weight of something he couldn't share. And when I pressed him, he snapped at me, his temper short, his eyes darting like a trapped man. It didn't take long before signs of Leon's influence became obvious. Cars started disappearing from the dealership lots, sold under the table for cash that never made it into company accounts. Payments went missing, contracts delayed. Denise mentioned to me that suppliers were complaining about unpaid invoices. It was the beginning of a rot that would spread fast, all because Raymond was too desperate to keep Leon quiet. At family gatherings, Leon made a point of sitting close to Raymond, whispering in his ear, grinning when anyone looked their way. Denise hated it. She told me once, "Mama, that man's a snake. And Ray, he's letting him back in. He's going to ruin everything Daddy built." She was right. Leon wasn't just here for money. He was here for revenge, for a chance to crawl back into the empire Harold had cast him out of. And Raymond, in his desperation to save face, was handing him the keys. For me, it was confirmation of what I already knew. Raymond wasn't just arrogant. He was reckless. The moment he lost control of the trust, he should have humbled himself, worked with me, and protected Harold's legacy. Instead, he turned to the very man Harold had warned us all about. Leon didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to lift a finger. His mere presence dragged Raymond deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of. And as I watched it unfold, I stayed silent. I didn't interfere. I didn't try to save Raymond from his own choices. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come from what you do to someone. It comes from stepping back and letting their worst decisions consume them. Raymond had thought he was invincible. Now, with Leon whispering poison in his ear and debts mounting in the shadows, I could already see the cracks spreading wider. He was no longer just embarrassed, he was trapped. And soon, he would realize that begging me for control was the least of his problems. It was Denise who came to me one evening, her face tense, her hands clutching a worn folder. We were sitting in her small living room, the kids already asleep, when she placed it on the coffee table between us. "Mama," she said quietly, "you need to see this." I looked at her, puzzled. She took a deep breath and opened the folder, pulling out copies of emails, insurance records, and hospital documents. My eyes moved across the pages slowly, the words tightening my chest with each line. It was paperwork from 3 years ago, during the time Harold had been in and out of the hospital for heart-related issues. Buried in those files was something chilling. Raymond had attempted to remove Denise as Harold's healthcare proxy and alter his coverage so that her name, and her children's, were excluded from future benefits. Denise's voice broke as she explained. "I only found this because a friend who worked at the hospital called me. She said she saw Raymond filing requests under Dad's name, trying to reassign authority so everything funneled through him. If it had gone through, I wouldn't have had coverage when I needed surgery last year. He wanted to cut me out completely, Mama. Me, his own sister." I sat there stunned, the papers trembling in my hands. All those nights Harold had been hooked up to machines, Denise had been the one running between the hospital and her shifts, making sure Harold was cared for, often sacrificing her own health. And yet, behind her back, Raymond had been plotting to erase her from even the basic protections a father owed his child. It wasn't just cruelty. It was premeditated betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" asked my voice heavy. Denise lowered her head. "Because I thought no one would believe me. Dad favored him so much, and Raymond always made me feel small. I didn't want to cause trouble when you were already carrying so much." I reached over and held her hand tightly. For years, Denise had been overlooked, not only by Harold but by the entire family dynamic that revolved around Raymond's arrogance. And here she was, holding evidence that proved what I had always felt deep down. Raymond wasn't just selfish. He was dangerous to his own blood. Later that week, I brought the folder to Mr. Franklin. He reviewed the documents carefully, nodding as he pieced it together. "This," he said, "is exactly the kind of evidence that will ensure Raymond never gains control over the trust. A man who would deliberately strip his sister of healthcare benefits is not someone the court, or any board, would consider responsible." I didn't need the lawyer's assurance to know it was true, but hearing it aloud gave me a renewed sense of clarity. Raymond had already been humiliated by the trust clause and the deed. Now, with Denise's files, there was a permanent record of his heartlessness. It wasn't just my word against his anymore. It was written proof. Word spread quietly through the family. Denise had never sought the spotlight, but once Terence heard, he confronted Raymond in a rare moment of strength. "You tried to cut out your own sister?" he asked, his voice shaking with rage. Raymond brushed him off, claiming it was just paperwork misunderstandings. But even Yolanda couldn't look him in the eye after that. The image of Raymond as the strong, rightful heir had already crumbled. Now it was rotting completely. For me, the discovery was painful but liberating. Painful because it confirmed just how deep Raymond's cruelty went, and liberating because it meant I no longer had to question myself. The trust Harold left me wasn't just an act of protection. It was a recognition that Harold had seen what Raymond was capable of. In a way, Harold had finally trusted me more than he trusted his own son. That night, as I sat on Denise's couch again, I realized something. Revenge didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it came in the form of evidence slipping into your hands at the right time, proof that vindicated years of quiet suffering. And as Raymond scrambled to keep his image intact, I held on to those files, knowing they were another nail in the coffin of the empire he thought he had inherited. The silent power shift was no longer just about dignity. It was about truth, and with every truth uncovered, Raymond's foundation sank deeper into the ground. For years, Terence had been the family's shame. The whispers about his addiction, the stories of stolen items, and the nights I lay awake wondering if he would survive another binge. All of it had made him invisible in Raymond's shadow. Even Harold, for all his pride in Raymond, could barely look at Terence without disappointment etched across his face. But what no one expected was that the same son everyone dismissed would become the one to drive the sharpest dagger into Raymond's facade. It began one afternoon when Terence asked to speak with me privately. His hands trembled, but his eyes were steady. "Mama," he said, "I remember something from when Dad was in the hospital. I didn't want to say anything before because I thought people would think I was lying. But now I think it matters." He told me about a night, nearly 6 months before Harold passed, when he had visited the hospital late. Terence had been sober then, just beginning to piece his life together, and he'd wanted to prove to his father that he was trying. When he walked into Harold's room, he found Raymond already there, with papers spread out on a clipboard. Harold was weak, heavily medicated, barely able to lift his head. Terence swore he heard Raymond coaxing Harold into signing documents. "It's just paperwork for the dealerships, Dad," Raymond said, guiding the pen into Harold's hand. Harold scribbled his name without even reading, his eyelids drooping as machines beeped around him. Terence had kept the memory buried, convinced no one would believe him because of his past. But now, with Denise's files and the lawyer's revelations, his story carried weight. I urged him to tell Mr. Franklin, and when he did, the lawyer's expression hardened. "If what you're describing is true," he said, "those signatures could be challenged. Any document signed under sedation, without full awareness, is questionable in court." Combined with the evidence Denise provided, this paints a very dangerous picture of Raymond's conduct. Terence's account became more than just a story. With Mr. Franklin's guidance, he described the scene in a sworn statement. Nurses who had been on shift that night were tracked down, and one recalled that Harold had been on strong medication at the time. It was enough to cast serious doubt on any papers Raymond had pushed through under the guise of business. When the rest of the family heard, the effect was immediate. Denise hugged her brother, whispering, "You did the right thing." For the first time in years, Terence stood taller, his shoulders squared not in shame but in pride. He had carried the burden of being the broken one, but now he was the one holding a piece of truth that mattered. Raymond, on the other hand, erupted in fury when confronted. He accused Terence of lying, of fabricating stories to get back at him. But the more he shouted, the more desperate he sounded. Terence remained calm, repeating his account with quiet strength. For once, Raymond's voice didn't drown him out. Even Yolanda, who had long clung to Raymond's side, looked unsettled. "Ray," she said softly, "if you really did that—" He cut her off sharply, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew fast. For me, Terrence's step forward meant more than I could express. My youngest son, the one Harold dismissed as weak, had been the only one brave enough to speak about what he saw. In doing so, he not only redeemed himself but also gave me another weapon in this silent war against Raymond's arrogance. It was proof that Harold had been manipulated in his weakest moments, and that Raymond's claim to legitimacy wasn't just fragile, it was rotten. I looked at Terrence that night, sitting in Denise's living room with his head held high, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a broken addict. I saw my son, the one who had stumbled, fallen, and clawed his way back to dignity. And I knew in that moment that Raymond's empire was crumbling from every direction, because the people he thought were beneath him were the very ones pulling him down. It was a Saturday afternoon when the knock came. Denise opened the door, and there stood a woman I had never seen before, with a teenage boy at her side. She was composed but carried the kind of tension you can feel in the air before words are even spoken. "Are you Mrs. Mitchell?" she asked. When I nodded, she drew in a long breath and said the words that stopped me cold. "My son deserves to be recognized." Harold was his father. For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Denise stared wide-eyed, Terrence froze mid-step, and I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. The boy looked no older than 15, tall, with Harold's jawline and eyes that didn't need words to tell the truth. His presence alone was enough to crack open a truth I had never been told. The woman introduced herself as Valerie, explaining that she had been involved with Harold years ago. It had started as a business arrangement, but when the boy was born, Harold provided quietly, ensuring Valerie's rent was paid and schooling covered. He never brought the child into the family picture, never dared to publicly acknowledge him. But now, with Harold gone, Valerie said she could no longer accept being in the shadows. "My son has rights," she said firmly, "and I intend to make sure he gets them." I could hardly process it. The betrayal stung, not just because Harold had strayed, but because he had kept a part of himself hidden even from me. Yet in that moment, staring at the boy's face, I knew the claim was real. I had lived with Harold long enough to see his reflection in those eyes. Raymond, however, reacted like a man cornered. The moment he heard the news, he stormed into Denise's home, his voice booming through the small rooms. "This is nonsense. She's lying. That boy isn't Dad's. She's just here for money." He towered over Valerie, dismissing her words as though shouting could erase the resemblance staring back at all of us. But Valerie didn't flinch. She pulled out paperwork, school forms with Harold listed as guardian, bank statements showing regular deposits from accounts tied to him, even letters he had written over the years. It wasn't speculation. It was evidence. Raymond's panic only deepened when Mr. Franklin confirmed the implications. If paternity is proven, the boy is entitled to a share of the estate. That share cannot be ignored or negotiated away. He is by law Harold's heir. Raymond tried everything to suppress it. He accused Valerie of fraud, threatened legal battles, even attempted to pay her off to disappear quietly. But what he didn't understand was that his resistance only made him look guiltier. The harder he pushed, the more people began to question what he was trying to hide. Denise shook her head at him in disgust. Terrence called him out for hypocrisy, and even Yolanda withdrew into silence, no longer able to defend his crumbling facade. As for me, I made no attempt to stop Valerie. I let her speak, let her evidence spread across the table for everyone to see. Because deep down, I knew the truth had to surface. Harold's choices, however painful, were part of his legacy. And if the boy was indeed his son, then pretending otherwise would only add another layer of deceit to a family already drowning in it. When Raymond realized I wouldn't side with him, his fury turned toward me. "You're supposed to protect this family," he spat. "You're letting them tear us apart." I looked at him calmly, my voice steady. "Raymond, protecting a family doesn't mean covering lies. It means facing them." Those words silenced him more than any argument could. For once, the power shifted not because of the will, not because of money, but because the truth itself weighed heavier than his arrogance. The legal chaos that followed was inevitable. DNA tests were arranged, lawyers prepared filings, and the reality of splitting Harold's empire became unavoidable. Raymond's empire, already shaky, was about to fracture even further. He had thought he could suppress the past, bury secrets like they never existed. But now the past had walked through the door in flesh and blood, and it was undeniable. And as I watched Valerie's son sit quietly beside her, his eyes cast downward, I couldn't help but think, the very child Harold kept in the shadows might become the light that finally revealed just how corrupt Raymond had become. Raymond had built his image not just around the family business but around his marriage to Yolanda. She was polished, beautiful, and had always played the role of the supportive wife, standing at his side during events, smiling as he introduced himself as Harold's heir. But that polished exterior began to crack the moment his lies at home could no longer be hidden. The first blow came with the condo in Atlanta. Yolanda adored that place. It was her escape, a high-rise apartment overlooking the city, where she could host her friends and pretend she was living the life of a true socialite. What she didn't know was that months before Harold's death, Raymond had mortgaged the property to cover debts he had racked up with Leon and other backroom dealings. When the letters came threatening foreclosure, Yolanda's world tilted. She stormed into the estate one evening, her voice echoing through the halls. "Ray, what is this? Why didn't you tell me?" She waved the notice in his face, her hands trembling. The staff froze, watching the scene unfold. For the first time, Raymond wasn't in control. He was cornered by his own wife. Raymond tried to bluff his way through it. "It's temporary. Just a business move. Once Mama releases the funds, everything will be fine." But the words rang hollow. Yolanda knew the truth now. There were no funds at his disposal. Every dollar passed through my hands, not his. The humiliation grew worse when it came to their children. Raymond had always boasted that he would put them through the finest schools, that the Mitchell legacy would guarantee them opportunities. But when tuition bills came due, Yolanda discovered that the accounts were nearly empty. Desperate to maintain appearances, she called me directly, her voice breaking. "Mrs. Mitchell," she whispered, "I don't know what else to do. The school is calling daily." I didn't hesitate. I paid the tuition myself, writing the check in my name. And I made sure the receipts were mailed to their home, not tucked away quietly. It wasn't spite, it was clarity. Everyone needed to see where the real stability in this family came from. When the receipts arrived, Yolanda confronted Raymond in front of the children. "Your mother paid their tuition, not you. Do you know what that feels like, Ray? To explain to our kids that their grandmother is keeping them in school while you're out here pretending to be in charge." Her voice cracked, and for once, the children's eyes weren't full of admiration for their father. They were full of disappointment. Raymond tried to regain his footing, but each attempt made him look smaller. The man who had once boasted about being the patriarch now sat silent at his own dining table, his wife's words cutting deeper than any business failure. Yolanda began spending more time away from him, retreating into her circle of friends, embarrassed by the whispers that followed her name. She stopped defending him at gatherings, stopped introducing him with pride. To the outside world, it looked like cracks in a marriage. But inside the family, it was something much deeper. Raymond's final mask slipping. He wasn't a provider, he wasn't a leader, and he wasn't the heir he had claimed to be. He was a man exposed, undone by his own arrogance, abandoned by the very people he thought would always stand at his side. For me, there was no satisfaction in watching Yolanda's pain, but there was truth in it. Raymond had once mocked me, saying I had nothing without Harold. Yet here he was, stripped of everything, dependent on the very mother he had thrown away. And unlike him, I didn't need to raise my voice or claim a title. I simply acted, quietly ensuring my grandchildren were secure, even if it meant their father's pride crumbled in the process. By the end of that season, Yolanda stopped wearing her wedding ring in public. The condo was gone, the accounts drained, and the family whispers grew louder. And Raymond. He was no longer seen as the man who inherited an empire. He was seen for what he really was, a man living on borrowed time, his own household slipping through his fingers. For Raymond, the dealerships were supposed to be his stronghold, the proof that he was Harold's true heir. He walked into those offices after the funeral with his chin high, shaking hands with employees, telling anyone who would listen that he was the new boss. For a while he managed to play the part. He called meetings, gave speeches, even signed papers with the same flourish Harold used to. But arrogance isn't the same as leadership, and within weeks, the cracks began to show. The first blow came when I met with Mr. Franklin to review the trust accounts tied to the business. What we discovered was alarming. Irregular withdrawals, unexplained payments, and discrepancies in dealership revenue that traced back to Raymond and Leon's dealings. Cars had been sold off record, invoices forged, cash slipping through the books. The files painted a picture of not just carelessness but corruption. I took immediate action. With the authority Harold had given me in the trust, I froze several accounts tied to the dealerships. Raymond walked into the bank one afternoon to withdraw funds for payroll, only to be told the accounts were inaccessible without my signature. He stormed into my presence afterward, his face red with rage. "You're destroying me, Mama," he shouted. But the truth was, he had already been destroying himself. When word reached the suppliers, the collapse accelerated. One by one, they began pulling contracts. Tire manufacturers refused to deliver shipments without upfront payment. Finance companies withdrew their credit lines. Even advertising agencies severed ties, unwilling to risk being dragged into Raymond's chaos. For decades, Harold's name had been a guarantee of stability. Under Raymond, it became a warning. Employees started whispering in the halls. Mechanics complained that their paychecks were late. Salesmen, once proud to work under the Mitchell name, began taking calls from competitors. The dealerships that had once buzzed with activity now sat half empty, customers hesitant to sign deals with a company drowning in uncertainty. And still, Raymond tried to keep up the performance. He drove up in expensive suits and cars, even as the lights flickered in his offices from unpaid bills. He gave orders with the same bravado, but everyone could see the fear in his eyes. The man who had once mocked me, calling me an old-for-nothing gold digger, now looked like a child pretending to run an empire. Behind the scenes, I moved strategically. I brought Denise into meetings, showing her the books Harold had kept, teaching her how the trust could sustain itself without Raymond's reckless hand. Terence, too, found purpose by helping review records, surprising everyone with his focus. For the first time, the empire Harold had built was no longer under the thumb of a single arrogant son. It was beginning to be shared by those who valued it. Raymond meanwhile spiraled deeper. Leon, who had once whispered promises of support, vanished as soon as the money dried up. When Raymond called him, he stopped answering. The debts remained, but the so-called uncle who had dragged him into darkness had already slipped away, leaving Raymond to bear the weight alone. By late autumn, the dealerships were shells of what they once had been. Empty lots, unpaid employees, broken contracts, all tied to Raymond's name. He had tried to hold on to control, but with every move I made, with every truth uncovered, his power dissolved. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. My revenge came not in a loud battle, but in silence, in the checks I signed, the accounts I froze, and the truths I let surface. Raymond thought the dealerships were his crown. By the time I was finished, that crown had turned to dust in his hands. And as the final suppliers walked away, leaving Raymond standing alone in empty showrooms, I saw it clearly. His control wasn't just slipping, it was gone. The empire he thought he had inherited had crumbled to ashes, and all that remained was the wreckage of his pride. By the time winter settled in, Raymond's downfall was no longer something whispered in boardrooms or law offices. It had spilled into the streets, visible for anyone with eyes to see. The man who once strutted through dealerships and dinner parties as Harold's heir was now reduced to fighting battles he couldn't win, and this time everyone was watching. The first blow to his image came when I instructed the trust's attorneys to repossess several vehicles he had claimed as his own. They weren't truly his. Most had been bought or leased under company accounts, tied directly to Harold's estate. Now that the records were in my control, I had the legal right to call them back. One by one, Raymond's prized cars disappeared from the driveway. The sleek Mercedes he loved to parade through town, the Escalade he drove his children to school in, even the sports car he bragged about buying in cash, all hauled away on flatbeds. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as tow trucks rolled in, whispering to each other about the fall of the new Mr. Mitchell. The humiliation only deepened at the dealerships. Board meetings that Raymond once stormed into with arrogance were now closed to him. With my signature as trustee, I locked him out of decisions, transferring oversight to interim managers while audits were completed. When he showed up demanding entry, security, men who had once tipped their hats to him, were ordered not to let him inside. He pounded on the glass doors, shouting threats, while employees inside averted their eyes. For years, he had barked orders and expected obedience. Now he was the one standing outside, powerless. Word spread quickly through the community. At church, people avoided his family's pew. At the country club, whispers trailed him like shadows. "He's not in control anymore," someone said within earshot of Yolanda. "His mother holds everything." Yolanda stopped attending social events altogether, unable to stomach the stares, while Raymond doubled down on bravado, trying to laugh off the repossessions as strategic restructuring. But no one was fooled. Even at home, the humiliation followed him. Children on the street pointed when they saw the empty driveway where his fleet of cars used to be. "Didn't your daddy have a Mercedes?" one of his son's classmates asked at school. Those small, cutting questions did more damage to Raymond's pride than any lawyer's words could. For me, the shift wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity. Raymond had once told me I was an old-for-nothing gold digger. Now, it was plain for the world to see who had truly built stability in this family. I didn't need to announce it. The empty spaces in his driveway, the whispers in the community, and the locked doors of the dealerships did the speaking for me. Denise noticed it too. "Mama," she said one evening. "He used to walk into a room and people moved for him. Now he walks in and they move away." Terence nodded in quiet agreement, pride flickering in his eyes as he saw his brother humbled in a way that no argument could have achieved. Raymond's desperation grew with each passing week. He borrowed cars from friends, only to return them late. He showed up uninvited at family gatherings, demanding respect that no one was willing to give. Even Yolanda's patience wore thin, her voice sharp whenever his name came up. "You're not the man you pretend to be, Ray," she snapped during one argument loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The humiliation wasn't just public. It was domestic, personal, inescapable. And still I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply allowed the consequences of his arrogance to unfold, step by step, until the once proud heir stood stripped bare before the very community he had tried to impress. By then, everyone knew the truth. Raymond wasn't the patriarch he claimed to be. He was a man brought low, not by strangers, but by the very mother he thought he could discard. And though his humiliation seemed complete, I knew the deepest fall was yet to come. It was a cold evening when Raymond finally came to me, not as the arrogant heir he once pretended to be, but as a broken man. I was sitting in Denise's living room, helping her children with their homework, when I heard the knock at the door. Denise opened it and froze. There stood Raymond. His suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders slumped. He looked nothing like the polished man who once strutted through our community calling himself Harold's successor. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please. I need to talk to you." Denise shot me a wary glance, but I nodded. She led the children upstairs, leaving us alone in the room. Raymond stepped inside, his hands trembling. For a long moment, he couldn't even speak. Then, as if the weight of months came crashing down at once, he dropped to his knees right there on Denise's carpet. The arrogance was gone. The pride that had carried him through funerals, boardrooms, and social gatherings had dissolved. All that remained was desperation. "Mama, please," he choked, tears streaming down his face. "I've lost everything. The dealerships are gone. The condo's gone. Yolanda barely speaks to me. I don't even have money for the kids' school clothes. Please restore me. I can't live like this." His words echoed the exact opposite of the ones he had spat at me months earlier when he called me an old-for-nothing gold digger. Back then, he stood tall while I carried a suitcase out of the mansion. Now he was on his knees, begging me for the very stability he once mocked. I looked at him for a long time. My heart as a mother ached to see my son so broken. But my resolve as the trustee of Harold's legacy was stronger. Quietly I shook my head. "Raymond," I said calmly, "your father trusted me to protect what he built. I will not put it back in the hands of the same man who nearly destroyed it. You've made your choices. You must live with them." He wept openly, clutching at my skirt like a child. "Please, Mama. I'll do better. I'll listen this time. Just give me control. People are laughing at me. I can't stand it anymore." But pity was not enough to erase the truth. He hadn't just failed himself. He had tried to strip his sister of healthcare, manipulated his father in a hospital bed, and betrayed the very family he was supposed to lead. Those were not mistakes born of ignorance. They were choices born of arrogance and greed. I gently pulled my skirt from his grasp and stood. "Raymond," I said, my voice steady, "a good name is worth more than money. You traded yours for pride. Now the world sees the truth. That cannot be undone." He lowered his head, sobbing into his hands. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of the room. He was a man stripped of pride, dignity, and illusion, left only with the consequences of his actions. When Denise came back downstairs, she found him still kneeling, tears soaking the carpet. She didn't scold him. She didn't comfort him either. She simply walked past, gathering the kids for bed, leaving him to face the silence of his fall. That night, Raymond left with nothing, not even the strength to slam the door behind him. And I knew deep in my soul that this was the true moment of reckoning. The empire Harold built had been protected, Denise and Terence had found their footing, and Raymond. He had been brought to his knees not by force, but by the weight of his own downfall. I didn't rejoice. I didn't gloat. I simply stood firm because revenge wasn't about shouting. It was about watching the proud fall and knowing you had protected the legacy they tried to destroy. In the end, my victory wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting in the streets or throwing Raymond out the way he once threw me. It came in silence, in signatures on paper, in meetings behind closed doors where I made decisions not out of anger, but out of clarity. The same clarity Harold must have had when he placed everything in my hands instead of his eldest son's. The trust gave me control, and I used it not to hoard wealth, but to secure the future of those who had been overlooked. Denise, who had worked herself to the bone as a nurse, finally received what she deserved. I helped her buy a home big enough for her children, a place where she could breathe without worrying about rent or bills. 4 years she had lived in Raymond's shadow, shrinking to avoid his ridicule. Now she stood tall, proud, with a home and stability of her own. Terence, too, found his footing. I arranged for him to take classes in business management, enrolling him in programs Harold would have never considered for him. He had been the forgotten child, the one dismissed as weak, but now he had a path to rebuild his life with dignity. His redemption became not just a story of recovery, but of trust restored, a reminder that no one should ever be written off entirely. And then there was Valerie's son, Harold's child from the shadows. It would have been easy to deny him, to pretend he didn't exist. But I had learned the hard way that ignoring the truth only allows lies to thrive. I let the claim go forward. DNA proved what we already knew, and I ensured he received a share of the estate. Some in the family bristled at it, but I held firm. He was Harold's son, and no child deserved to carry the weight of secrecy forever. Raymond, meanwhile, was left with nothing but the ruins of his pride. He still lived in the mansion for a time, but it wasn't truly his. Every bill passed through my hands. Every car he drove could be recalled with a single phone call. Every attempt he made to assert himself only reminded others of how far he had fallen. Neighbors who once envied him now pitied him. His friends who had flocked to his dinners stopped calling. Even Yolanda pulled away, her silence louder than any argument. He had wanted to rule like a king, but in the end, he became a cautionary tale. Not because I shouted his sins from the rooftops, but because I didn't need to. His downfall was plain for all to see, and my silence only made it clearer. Looking back, I realized that revenge didn't need fire and fury. It needed patience. It needed truth. It needed a mother who refused to be erased. Raymond had tried to throw me out of my own home, to call me worthless, to strip me of dignity. But in the end, it was me who rewrote the Mitchell legacy, me who secured the future of my children and grandchildren, me who proved that no one can erase a mother's worth. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply stood firm, and in that firmness I won. That was my victory. Not just the money, not just the mansion, but the knowledge that I had taken back everything that mattered and restored it to the hands of those who would honor it. Raymond was left with nothing but his pride in ashes, and I was left with a quiet, unshakable truth. He had underestimated me, and in doing so, he destroyed himself.